Good morning. Oh, no. This is the call and response part of the program. Good morning. That's much better. Chris, thank you for those very kind and warm words. We first met when you and your colleagues were good enough to invite me to your campus. I think the opportunity to engage with your campus was certainly worthwhile for me, but the opportunity to learn from your students was the high point of my visit. My experience has been that if we listen to them, they take us in important and continuingly challenging ways on all of the issues that we've been talking about. It is an enormous honor for me to receive this award. I'm grateful, Chris, to you, to your entire team, Jan, to your board, to the awards committee. You'll forgive a point of personal privilege when I recognize one of your leadership, my dear friend John Stalby, who I had the good fortune to meet years ago when we were freshmen at Williams College. And that's about all I'm going to say about that right now. And I am humbled when I hear the list of former recipients, organizations, and individuals who have received this award before me, and hope to be worthy of them in the days and years to come. I'm particularly pleased, as Chris mentioned, to be receiving this award on the 10th anniversary of when the inaugural award was presented to my own Phi Beta Kappa Society, who, if I may say so, was a perfect recipient for an award in advocacy for the arts and sciences, because advocacy for the arts and sciences is in the Phi Beta Kappa Society very DNA. But this is a little more complicated than it may sound at first blush. Because, of course, Phi Beta Kappa is a nonpartisan organization. That means any advocacy we do is nonpartisan. And the expression nonpartisan advocacy, certainly in Washington, D.C. these days, sounds like an oxymoron. Let me assure you, it is not. Discussing the nature of nonpartisan advocacy for the arts and sciences, both for the Phi Beta Kappa Society and for the shared mission of all of us in this room and the institutions that we represent, necessarily asks us to consider the very question of the nature of the university. Put somewhat differently, when I say that we should engage in advocacy, not we personally, but we institutionally, who exactly are we? So that's what I'd like to think a little bit about this morning with all of you. But first, allow me to turn back and share a little bit of Phi Beta Kappa history and where we come by our role as advocates. As I suspect some of you know, Phi Beta Kappa was founded in the early days of the American Revolution, to be precise, December 5th, 1776. And some of you may know the fabled story, at least those of you here from William and Mary, you know who you are in the Alpha chapter. On the cold winter night of December 5th, 1776, 5 undergraduates of the College of William and Mary gather at the Raleigh Tavern in the Apollo Room, making us the first secret society in America that was founded in a bar. But it's actually not at all surprising that it was founded in a tavern. Turns out that most of the revolutionary movements in the early part of the American Republic were founded either in taverns or coffee houses, what I like to describe as the two core beverages for undergraduates. But actually, more important, they were places of quasi-public gathering, where one could gather to discuss challenging ideas, revolutionary ideas, outside of the prying ears of the crown. And so they did. And we know a little bit about what they actually did that night. We know, for example, that they adopted a name for their new organization, which was not Phi Beta Kappa. It was in Latin, Societas Philosophia, Philosophic Society. And they adopted a motto in Greek that night, Philosophia Biou Kubernetes, from which we take our initials, Phi Beta Kappa. Philosophia Biou Kubernetes is usually translated by us and others as love of learning is the guide of life. But my classics colleagues, any classicists in the room? Oh, dear God, so I've got to get it right. Okay. Here goes nothing. Hands-on buzzers, right? Kubernetes, from which actually one of the roots of the English word governor, but Kubernetes in classical Greek actually has a marine or nautical connotation. So actually a slightly better translation of Philosophia Biou Kubernetes is not love of learning as the guide of life, but love of learning as the pilot of life. And there is a subtle but a significant difference. A guide, you see, takes you on a path that already exists. But the pilot steers you out into the water where there is no path yet. And sometimes the waters are choppy, as they were during the early days of the American Revolution, and in many ways as they are in our time. And when they gathered in the Raleigh Tavern that night, they committed themselves to an astonishing idea that when the waters were choppy, it would be the love of learning that would be the pilot of their life. Not the crown, not any dogma, but the love of learning and the commitment to the liberal arts. This process of learning is both inward-looking and outward-looking. It concerns both the inner shifts of vision that produce a meaningful life and the outward-facing process that builds community and brings about change, locally, nationally, and yes, even globally. Now, there are many examples I could give you of the ways in which the love of learning has pushed Phi Beta Kappa towards nonpartisan advocacy, calling on us to seek to change the world. The one I shall choose is the signature legislative accomplishment of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, and that is the founding of the National Endowments for the Arts and the Humanities. In 1963, Phi Beta Kappa, along with the American Council of Learned Societies, an earlier recipient of this award, and the American Graduate Schools Council, co-sponsored a commission that would recommend what turned into the enabling legislation that created the NEH and the NEA. And on September 29th, 1965, President Johnson signed that enabling legislation, creating the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The legislation itself presents the case for the arts and humanities as a national need, and it was ultimately approved by both houses of Congress by wide and bipartisan measures. Listen to some of the language of the enabling legislation itself. The arts and the humanities belong to all the people of the United States. Or Section 3. An advanced civilization must not limit its efforts to science and technology alone, but must also give full value and support to the other great branches of scholarly and cultural activity in order to achieve a better understanding of the past, a better analysis of the present, and a better view of the future. Or perhaps most poignant to us today, the world leadership which has come to the United States cannot rest solely upon superior power, wealth, and technology, but must be solidly founded upon worldwide respect and admiration for the nation's high qualities as a leader in the realm of ideas and of the spirit. These words indeed echo those nearly 2 centuries earlier when President George Washington said the following to Congress: "The assembly to which I address myself today is too enlightened not to be fully sensible how much a flourishing state of the arts and sciences contributes to national prosperity and reputation." Now, I do not look to Washington's words or to the legislation that created the humanities for a nostalgia or look to a lost world of consensus. Rather, I look to it as a statement of what nonpartisan advocacy and support of the arts, humanities, and sciences can look like and what it can achieve. A decade and a half later, 1981, Phi Beta Kappa was among the founding members of the National Humanities Alliance, the NHA, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar and many of you are involved. The NHA is an advocacy coalition dedicated to advancing the humanities. Over the past 12 to 18 months, working in concert with the NHA and other members, Phi Beta Kappa has played a role not only in preventing the defunding of the humanities, but also the highly successful effort to maintain and even increase the funding for the national endowments. In related developments, nonpartisan advocacy efforts throughout the higher education space have led to an increase in NIH allocations, as well as allocations for supplemental education grants, federal work-study programs, and funds for historically black colleges and universities and Hispanic-serving institutions. So, to what extent should all of you and the colleges and universities that you represent be engaged in such advocacy efforts on your campuses and in your communities? Well, to answer that question, we must first consider a fundamental and essential question. Precisely on whose behalf would you be advocating? Which brings us to the very nature of the university and requires us to confront the surprisingly complex puzzle of who is the university? Let's begin with first principles. American colleges and universities have played a singular role in our society. They are institutions that educate each generation for meaningful lives, for productive lives, and for engaged lives. They have been one of the core engines of social mobility from colonial times, enabling the children of farmers to become professionals and opening a new world of higher education through the Morrill Land-Grant Colleges Act, 1862, an astonishing achievement in the midst of a civil war. From the late 19th and 20th centuries, enabling children of immigrants to enter the American economy and society, enabling women and African Americans to study those who had been excluded from higher education until Oberlin opened its doors to women and African Americans in 1833, and Mount Holyoke opened its doors in 1837. Through the mid-20th century, allowing returning World War II veterans to advance through the visionary GI Bill, and yes, to our time, enabling students from around the globe and every stratum of American society, citizen and undocumented alike, to enter institutions of higher education and claim the prerogatives promised of a free society. In order to answer the critical question, the question of who is the university, allow me to suggest that we turn to legal theory. Or as my wife said when reviewing this manuscript of mine, as she does everything I've written going back to college, dear God, you're not going to bring out the lawyers. Well, in truth, throughout the history of American higher education, the law has played a critical role in defining the scope, mission, and very nature of colleges and universities. So let's start with the observation that the university is an institution with a governing board and many stakeholders, and thus bears some similarity with the general corporate structure, another abstract entity that is created by the law. So it might be a good place to look for the answer to the question, who are we? But the differences are significant and they are fundamental. Whereas the corporation ultimately is owned by and owes its duties to its shareholders, the university's duties are to all its constituencies, students, faculty, alumni, staff, and even beyond to the local community, nation, perhaps even the world. And its ownership, per se, transcends any specific group of individuals. In the for-profit model, the shareholders are the owners of the corporation, and although they are not engaged in the day-to-day management, it is fair to say the corporation is run in their interests. So if I were to ask, technically, legally, who owns the corporation, the answer is the shareholders. But when I ask who owns the university, the answer is far less clear. We think of the university's trustees as fiduciaries, not as owners. They are not the same as corporate directors. We'll come back to boards of trustees a little later when we consider a celebrated Supreme Court case that marks its bicentennial next year and will provide us, I believe, with an answer to the question, who are we? There's a range of constituencies represented within the world of higher education, and it's worthwhile spending a few minutes on each and asking as to each, what's the source of their power or authority within the university, the nature of their rights and responsibilities, and then to evaluate the merits of the claim to be the university. So perhaps the most obvious place to begin in this room is with the faculty. There's a story told from the time when Dwight Eisenhower was the president of Columbia University in the late 40s, early 1950s. Perhaps at the very first faculty meeting he held, he made the mistake of referring to the faculty as the staff of the university. I have to tell you, there are two kinds of rooms in which I have shared this story. Those who need no explanation, and those for whom no explanation would do any good. So after Eisenhower said that, a hand goes up in the back of the room. And a senior member of the faculty said, "General Eisenhower," not President, "General Eisenhower, I am not a member of the staff of the university. I am a tenured member of the faculty of Columbia College. You, sir, are the staff of the university." At which point one imagines that the former Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe must have thought to himself, what the hell just happened to me? The concern about thinking of faculty as simply employees of the university is of long standing. The celebrated 1915 Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure, and for those of you who have not had occasion ever, or in any event recently, to revisit the 1915 Declaration, although it has been largely superseded by the 1940 Declaration, which the Association of American University Professors now really focuses on. Go back and reread the 1915 Declaration. I do consider it one of the high water marks of the articulation of the principles of academic freedom and of the university. The 1915 Declaration challenged trustees who thought of the university-faculty relationship strictly as one of employer-employee, and said that it misunderstood the very nature of the university. In doing so, they failed to understand, in the words of the Declaration, and I'm quoting here, the full implications of the distinction between private proprietorship and the public trust. As described by Professors Matthew Finken and Robert Post in their book For the Common Good, they failed fundamentally to appreciate that the true university served the common good by producing knowledge, and that the production of knowledge requires freedom of inquiry. To the extent that the work of the university is about producing knowledge, both the creation of new knowledge and the transmission of inherited knowledge, there is no question that the faculty of a college or a university is central to the institution's very existence. And yet, would we say that the faculty are the university? The answer, I believe, lies in the very essence of academic freedom, and the essence that is best seen when we contrast academic freedom with freedom of expression, often confused as two ways of saying the same thing. They most decidedly are not. Closely related, but significantly different. Freedom of expression is an individual right. I have a right against government interference with my expressive activity, grounded philosophically in the nature of personal human freedom and core Enlightenment values, and grounded legally in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Academic freedom, on the other hand, is a group right in which we as academics share as individuals only insofar as we are engaged in the performance of our professional obligations and the work of the academy, creating, discovering, and transmitting knowledge. Thus, while faculty are central to the very idea of the university, we would not say that they are the university. And certainly no individual faculty member could claim the mantle individually of the institution. Now, when I discuss the very nature of the university each year on the first day of my higher education and the law seminar at Georgetown Law School, you will not be surprised to know that the members of the class immediately seize not on faculty, but on themselves, students. And they suggest that students are the sine qua non of the university. And of course, there is something important to this idea. In a philosophical sense, students are key to at least part of the very function of transmitting knowledge. We transmit knowledge through our teaching as well as our scholarship. And in a concrete and financial sense, it is the tuition and fee payments of students that play an important role in the fiscal stability and vitality and viability of our institutions, and on some campuses, overwhelmingly so. But if students provide an important part in identifying the nature of the university, it is ultimately a limited account. First of all, there is such a thing as a university without students. Rockefeller University in New York and the University of California at San Francisco have no undergraduate students and only graduate or medical students, respectively. All Souls College at Oxford has no students at all and houses only members of the Oxford faculty who write and who lecture. And even for the vast majority of institutions that, of course, have student bodies, the time of those students on campus is of limited duration. Suppose then we expand the category of students from their time on campus to their lifelong relationship with the university. As president of Brandeis, I always used to open convocation and close the commencement address by reminding them that they are undergraduates 4 years, they are alumni for the rest of their lives. So alumni are clearly a significant constituency of the university, but neither current students nor alumni can claim to be the institution itself. Ideally, they are in close relationship with the institution, they feel connected to it, but football chants aside, they would not claim to be the university. In those same commencement addresses, I would remind those students who felt the university slipping out of their hands during that last week of senior week, places do not belong to us. We belong to places. So, to a room full of deans, I would be remiss if I did not suggest perhaps it belongs to the administration. Dear God. But as administrators, deans, provosts, presidents, we are charged with the management of the university or college. But no healthy college president, provost, or dean would imagine that she or he is the college. Indeed, we think of ourselves more as stewards, less as managers, and certainly not as owners. The members of the administration are stewards of an institution that is entrusted to our care for a limited period of time. Our task, one might even say our sacred task, is to leave it better than we found it, and then pass it on to another who will seek to do the same. But what exactly is it that we are passing on? That lies elsewhere. There are many other constituencies who might reasonably lay claim to the very essence of the university. Consider members of the staff, for example, who dedicate their lives to the institution and without whom the institution could not function. I would recommend to you a book of photo essays of staff members from Harvard University with the evocative and compelling title, Harvard Works Because We Do. The staff, however, works for it. They are not it. Donors, too, might stake a claim here, especially in our time when a combination of tuition income and public funding leaves many institutions, public and private, with shortfalls to cover. But if it were necessary, we relearned only recently in the controversy over whether a certain foundation's gift to a certain university might have involved the right to hire and fire faculty, a core principle of academic freedom that limits the reach of donors. Donors may and should have input on the nature of the projects and programs they support, but core academic functions, appointment, promotion, and tenure of faculty, free inquiry of faculty research, and the establishment of the curriculum must rest with the institution, not its supporters, however well intended. So who gets to say, we are the university? So as a strictly legal matter, that would be the Board of Trustees in a private institution or the equivalent Board of Regents or the like in a public college or university. After all, they bear the ultimate fiduciary responsibility. And here I do believe our search begins to bear fruit, but in an unexpected way. Now, as promised, we turn now to a celebrated Supreme Court decision from 1819 by the great Chief Justice John Marshall, who I may add with some parochial pride, was a member of the Alpha Chapter of Phi Beta Kappa at William and Mary. So those who had 2 in the office pool for how many times I would mention the Alpha Chapter win. The case is a case called Dartmouth College against Woodward, and it is probably most famous today for 2 reasons. First, Dartmouth College's lawyer before the court was its illustrious alumnus, Daniel Webster, who in his oral argument to the court described his client as a small college, but there are those of us who love her. Second, this was the initial case to interpret a fairly technical clause in Article 1 of the Constitution that prohibits a state from passing a law impairing the obligation of contracts. But for us, the Dartmouth College case is where Chief Justice Marshall laid the legal foundation of institutions of higher learning in the New Republic, and fundamentally took on our question of who is the university. Dartmouth College against Woodward involved the effort of the state of New Hampshire to amend the college's charter in 1816. The original charter from 1769 was with the Crown. That charter created a self-replicating board of trustees of the kind familiar to most private institutions today. But it also did something unusual. It permitted the founding president, Reverend Eleazar Wheelock, to name his own successor. And the good Reverend Wheelock chose his son, John, who became president upon his father's death in 1779. Now, over the next 3 decades, the trustees had a major falling out with John Wheelock. They determined his approach was no longer in the best interests of the colleges, and after a period of some controversy, they ultimately dismissed him. The Jeffersonian Republicans in New Hampshire took up John's cause, and when they came to power in the state, the legislature enacted a law that replaced the system by which the small Dartmouth board was comprised with a larger board appointed by the governor. In fact, the governor did appoint such a board, and they began to run something called Dartmouth University. The original trustees of Dartmouth College sued in the name of the college against William Woodward, who had been the treasurer of the college but had since defected to Dartmouth University. Now, for the constitutional lawyers in the room, you know who you are. The court focused on 2 main issues. Was the 1769 charter of Dartmouth College from the British monarchy a contract for purposes of Article 1 of the Constitution? And if so, the second question, did the New Hampshire law interfere with the obligation of that contract? And the court answered both questions in the affirmative. But there is a lurking third question, and that's our question. And that is, who gets to assert this claim? It's a question that lawyers would call one of standing, but for us here today, it is better thought of as a question of identity. Who is Dartmouth? Is it its founders? Chief Justice Marshall said no. Or, to use his felicitous expression, the youth for whose benefit the college was founded? He said no again. In fact, only the trustees had complained about this law, but they, Marshall noted, had no beneficial interest to be protected. The charter, John Marshall said, created an artificial, immortal being. An artificial, immortal being. And he went on to note that donors contributed to the artificial, immortal being, not to make a profit, but for something that in their opinion was of inestimable value. And as to this, neither the donors nor their own descendants could be their representatives, nor were the students whom their generosity might someday benefit. It is the college and the college alone that is their representative, John Marshall's artificial immortal being. The thing that is of inestimable value, strictly speaking, is not even the college itself, but rather the mission of the college. Artificial, yes, but also immortal. It is the pursuit of knowledge, inherited, discovered, and created. And it is the transmission of that knowledge. It is only by speaking in the name of that mission that one speaks in the name of the college. The owners of the college, in other words, are not those who attend it, those who work for it, those who teach at it, those who administer it, or those who govern it. The closest thing to being an owner of the artificial immortal being that is the university is the very mission of the university itself. Oh, if John Marshall could have had a crystal ball, what might he say about our time? How would he ask us to defend this artificial immortal being? The being that is the essence of the institutions that we love. I believe he would recognize our difficult moment. I believe he would say that the mission of the liberal arts and sciences universities and colleges compels us not only to our teaching and to our scholarship, but it compels us towards advocacy in the time in which we live. Advocacy for academic freedom, advocacy for free inquiry, advocacy for free expression, and advocacy for the liberal arts and sciences as a public good on our campuses and in our communities. That is the mission that was captured by the founders of Phi Beta Kappa, who spoke not just of learning itself, but of the love of learning. That would be the guide of their lives. Their words were an inspiration. They inspire still. Thank you. For some questions, if there are any, and usually while I say this, microphones magically drop from my experience. If there are no questions, there are two explanations, only one of which is that it was all clear. You probably are familiar with the difference between the junior faculty member and the senior faculty member. They walk out of the junior faculty member's lecture and they say, person is so incompetent, I could not understand a single word he said. And they walk out of the senior faculty member's lecture, they say, and a word that he said. I'm going to let that one sink in a little bit. Okay, we got a question.
Enjoyed your talk. It was a wonderful talk, very enlightening. And as I was listening to it, especially to your conclusion, I was thinking of all the various different kinds of academic institutions we have in this country. Everything from nonprofit, private, public, to for-profits. And my question is, do all the various kinds of institutions fit the thesis of your lecture, that is, it's the pursuit of knowledge that is the real university?
Thank you. I think it's a great question. I think I am speaking of what I understand to be the mission of liberal arts and sciences institutions. And I would say that both descriptively, that schools that see as their mission the liberal arts and sciences, this is what they do. And I would also say proscriptively that this is what the highest aspiration of American higher education should be. I do not believe it accurately describes all institutions of higher education in this country. And those that are not I think are entitled to do what they do, and they should make transparent what it is they do, but that should not be mistaken for the mission of the liberal arts and sciences.
Thank you for your talk, which is very persuasive to me. And as I go back to my campus and I'm thinking about how to relay Marshall's words to students who take a very transactional approach to their education, what words would you suggest that I use to convey the sense of this wonderful immortal being of the mission in a very transactional mindset of this generation?
Yeah, I think, it's not either or, and as a matter of fact, John Marshall, besides being Phi Beta Kappa and a Supreme Court justice, was a pretty, sharp-elbowed politician, Secretary of State, and got himself appointed by John Adams in the very last days of the Adams administration before Jefferson came in. So it's only with benefit of hindsight that he's the great John Marshall at the time. He knew how to play the game too. So I don't think it's an either or, and we sometimes fall into that. John will remember when we were at Williams, and I think many of you will resonate with the same types of memories, certainly in the 60s, 70s, even early 80s. We were told things like, enjoy the privilege of doubt, these are the best 4 years of your life, don't worry about what comes next. I'm not sure that was great advice then, it would be terrible advice now. I think they're right to be concerned, and I think we sometimes cartoon them. When students say, I'm worried about what comes next, or I'm worried about how I'm going to pay my debt, or I'm worried about getting a job, we often too quickly leap to say, those are the kinds of concerns that shouldn't preoccupy you. These are the 4 years to think the great thought. I think it's not only, first of all, it renders you clueless when you talk like that, right? But beyond that, there's something kind of cruel about it, because they are right to be concerned. Having said that, then, I think we can talk about the role of Marshall's immortal being in their practical part of their lives as well as the philosophical part of their lives. I mean, I always refer to the liberal arts as being key to the meaningful life, the productive life, and the engaged life as members of their communities. Those things do not fight with each other. One should certainly be engaged in a meaningful exercise of the life of the mind. But if it's true that the unreflected life is not worth living, it's also true that the unlived life is not worth reflecting upon. So I think what we tell our students is that what they are learning are skills that will give them a more meaningful life and a better life, but also will contribute to a more productive life, and that they should not fall into the trap all too common in this society now of very short-term thinking. Their careers will not be determined by their first job. And by the way, they get that better than we do. When I'm in rooms full of parents and students and I talk about a dozen or more jobs, and there's still parents who look shocked with that, and the students, that's just hard news programming. That doesn't surprise them at all. So I think these things actually do play, work well together. Last little soundbite from George Anders' wonderful book, You Can Do Anything with That. It's about the value of a liberal arts degree. Highly recommend Anders' work, by the way, on this. The best predictor of a six-figure salary is students who take courses outside their major. So if you don't buy the philosophical argument, you can bottom line it.
Hi, I'm not a lawyer, and I'd like you to continue to be one for a moment on my behalf, please, and to continue to educate us. I was interested in the intellectual pivot that you made from thinking about people and classes of people and groups of people and setting us up that way to then turn into the idea that the law, in this case, was defined by an idea or a set of ideas or a set of values, and then translate that to how that often seems to be the case these days on college campuses, where we think about taking care of groups of various kinds and how do we, and this is putting on your civil rights hat for a moment, and we think often about these groups in particular kinds of ways and what can we do for them, how do we enable them, how do we give opportunities to them. Could you talk a little bit more about the idea of thinking about it in a more kind of legal value-laden way in which instead of, say, taking care of a certain class of people, we're actually thinking about legally issues of fairness or legally issues of access, or legally values that as a university we might want to espouse, and how that can have a certain kind of legal efficacy inside the worlds that we're trying to, I think, create for our students and for our faculty.
I think there's a lot of ways of grappling with that. Let me suggest a couple. I think when we think about the mission of the institution in its immortal sense, then it's a mission that affects all members of the community. And then we have to ask who those people are and how do we treat them and best advance their interests as members of the community, lifelong members of the community. And then the sort of obvious recognition, but it's a recognition that has a lot of analytic power to it, that these people have very different stories and very different journeys and bring very different places to it. So let me take an example out of the free speech context. I'm glad, by the way, that my friend Bob Zimmer is going to be talking this afternoon. I actually had Bob come to a Phi Beta Kappa board meeting, and as I would say this if you're standing right here, I think he's got a lot of the stuff in Chicago importantly right, and a lot of it significantly wrong in my view. So ask him hard questions. And when you say that, he'll say, shoot, Fred probably really was there. Okay. But here's what I would say in the free speech area, and this is something that I have learned from a lot of time talking with students on campus in Northern Illinois, but a lot of other places with students. And let me just digress for a second. The most important year in my scholarly development on issues of free expression was after stepping down from Brandeis, before coming to Phi Beta Kappa. I had the joy of being a visiting professor at Yale for a year, and I was my wife and I were residential fellows in one of the residential colleges, which, by the way, is the best gig going. You know, to be the head of a college, that's a job. To be a residential fellow is like being a grandparent. If you want to play with the kids, you play with the kids. You don't want to play with the kids, you don't have to play with the kids. And for the first time in well over a decade, and I think you will all understand this, because I was not a dean and I was not a president, they just talked to me normally. And frankly, I just talked normally to them. I wasn't worried about seeing it in the paper the next day. And they weren't worried about what they were saying to the president or the dean. So I learned a lot by listening to them that year. Here's one of the important things I learned. Yes, I believe, it will not surprise you, I'm sure, that free expression, robust free expression, almost unrestricted free expression, that's a long footnote for another talk at another time, what the almost piece means, is essential to academic pursuits on a campus. But free expression exacts a cost on the community. I believe it is a cost worth bearing, but it exacts a cost on the community. And here's the piece I learned from listening to students. It is not a cost that falls equally on all members of the society. Some members of the community are bearing more than their fair share of the costs. So when one, and that's not an argument for repressing speech in my view, but it is an argument for how a society and how a community and how a college and how a university has to respond to certain incidents. So when you do, you will necessarily respond in different ways. You may put a stronger thumb on the scale at certain times, and the president or the chancellor might say, we stand for this at this university. And we channel these values from our founding at this university in a way that maybe she wouldn't and, for other students' issues. So in terms of access, in terms of how a class is comprised, an issue that is very apt right now, it is ludicrous to think that all members of the community have identical backgrounds, identical starting points. They don't. We aspire to that sometime. Not in my lifetime will it be achieved. I'm sorry, it's a longer answer but I hope it was useful. Please.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. In the end of 1960s, we were able to put human being on the moon. So that clearly showed that our education, universities, research, engineering is the world class. So we were leaders in education. Do you think we are still leaders in the world education?
I think in our labs and on our campuses, we are. I am concerned that there is understanding of the obligations of the government to support research in the way in which it needs to. I will share with you my single most out-of-body experience in all my years as president of Brandeis. And there were plenty, but the single most actually took place in Bangalore. I was meeting with the head of the National Center for Biological Sciences. major neuroscience institution. Brandeis has got a major neuroscience program of its own, and many of our PhDs were faculty at the NCBS. We struck a deal to essentially share graduate students and postdocs who were going to do 6 months in each campus on a shared project that the PIs would be working on the 2 different campuses. So you can see, it was a very exciting idea for the undergraduates, for the students, and for us to be collaborating with partners halfway around the world. At the end of this discussion offline, before the signing ceremony with the director of the Institute, he said to me, and of course, funding won't be a problem. And I keep a big smile on my face, trying not to give away the fact that I have no idea what the man is talking about. Since when has funding ever not been the problem? And he explained to me that his country, and India's got plenty of challenges and plenty of problems, but his country was giving him so much money to spend on research, he literally could not spend it all in country. He had to have international collaboration. And I thought to myself, where's my team? So I worry about this. And I think the language from that enabling legislation rings home to me so powerfully that what makes us the most powerful country in the world, and it is terribly, terribly important that we continue to be, is not our military strength and not our economic strength. It is that we have had the best ideas. And if we ever lose that, God help America. Thank you all.